Maybe
Right.
talk about the liquidity providers as well. What's the chance for everyone being a part of this?
Right. Okay. So let's say that you've got a little stash of money, right? Um, and let's say that that value that you've accumulated has the opportunity to sit in different places. It could just sit as euros, but as euros they're devaluating, right? You're losing purchasing power. The same with dollars. And we used to have savings. Now the interest rates are close to zero, so the concept of savings doesn't really work anymore. But the concept of savings was that you didn't want to take a risk into an asset. You would rather just hold on to the money in itself. But to combat inflation, the erosion of your value, you had an interest rate that would pay you, right? That's kind of gone, which means that you really have to put your money into an asset now. And the issue with assets is they all carry risk, different kinds of risk. I mean, if you buy a German bond, it carries a spread against a U.S. Treasury bond, right? In other words, Germany is considered to be less safe than the United States. If you buy Greek debt, it's even higher. If you buy corporate bonds, they have their own level of exposure. So now you come to the liquidity pool. And a liquidity pool is really a very interesting device because one of the things it does is it eliminates counterparty risk. So when you buy a corporate bond, some corporation issued that bond, you gave them money, you lent them money, they promised to repay it. But things don't go well. They can't sell their products, they have a shit team or whatever, and they go under. And now you can't get your money back, right? So you say, okay, the problem was that wasn't a large enough corporation. It was a small company. It was a bad idea to invest in small companies. I should invest in bonds in larger companies because there's safety in how much they have in reserves. But then large companies go under, right? Because the entire sector goes downhill or whatever. So then you say, okay, well, I should invest in nations because, but then nations default. Mexico defaulted and Venezuela has defaulted, and so this issue of counterparty risk is very real, and it doesn't go away no matter how big the issuer is. So now you come to liquidity pools. What's fascinating about liquidity pools is that there is zero counterparty risk. That liquidity pool will never default, right? It can't because it's sitting on all the cash. So that at any point in time, you can, even if everybody else withdraws their liquidity, they don't withdraw your liquidity. You will still have those tokens, and you can always redeem those tokens for at least the amount of money that you put in, right? So it's from a risk perspective, not only is there no counterparty risk, but there's also no operational risk, and there's no market risk. What I mean by that is, let's say that your company doesn't default, right? But the bonds that the company issued and that you bought have a price, and the price fluctuates, and you are therefore exposed to, you bought this bond for this price, and now it's down here. And so you potentially lost money if you need to liquidate at that point. The thing with bonds is that you can always get your money back if you just wait the term. If you wait the entire 30 years, you will eventually get your money back, but you might need to sell it before, and the market might be down, and so you incur loss, right? This kind of loss doesn't exist with liquidity pools. So in some ways, the liquidity pool is really a breakthrough in the investment world, and I think is one that Wall Street hasn't yet caught on to, right? They haven't yet understood the power of liquidity pools. And so let me explain a little bit about why, right? Liquidity pools usually have two assets, and let's say that those assets can vary in price with respect to each other. Mind you, they don't have to. You could put two assets in a liquidity pool that that never change in value with respect to each other. For example, we could put V dollars and USDC into a pool. The USDC is always worth exactly $1 because there's $1 in a bank account that you can burn the token for if you want. And the V dollar is eventually going to be exactly $1 because because it can always be spent as $1. And so these two things won't vary against each other. And if they ever do, someone is going to say, oh, look, there's a variance between these two things, and they will buy the cheaper one and sell the more expensive one and bring the pool back into equilibrium, right? So the liquidity pool itself doesn't have mechanisms to bring the price back to equilibrium. The market does as a function of a profit, right? If we see a merchant dumps a large amount of V dollars onto this liquidity pool that has USDC in it, what happens internally to the liquidity pool is that the price of USDC goes up because now there's so many V dollars that they are now less in price. There should always be 1-to-1, right? 100 V dollars to 100 USDC or 200 V dollars to 200 USDC. But if a market participant does a transaction in any direction, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be putting one asset and taking out the other asset and therefore create an imbalance. Now you have a situation where the V dollars are cheap and the USDC is expensive. And someone goes, oh my goodness, look at the opportunity to buy Vow really cheap right now. So they take USDC, they put it into the liquidity pool to get those V dollars out, which they're buying cheap at a discount, and that rebalances the pool to parity again. And because they bought these V dollars cheap, they can now go spend them at some store and get a discount for having used the V dollar, right? So that is an example of a liquidity pool where the two assets have a natural equilibrium. One of the consequences of this activity is that every time that a merchant says, I've got some V dollars, I need to burn into real money, into banked money, and he puts the V dollars into it, gets the USDC out, which he can then redeem for banked money, he pays a transaction fee. And that transaction fee is a percentage of the amount. So as the volume of business on the ecosystem grows, and as more merchants come to this liquidity pool to dump the V dollars and get USDC out, the liquidity providers make money, right? And that's I think it's paying right now 0.3% so it's 30 basis points, 0.3% per transaction fee. That can add up. That can produce an enormous amount of yield, right? If that liquidity pool is very busy, transaction after transaction, and merchants just doing business all day, every day, right? That can be a mountain of reward for the liquidity provider at zero risk, because at any point in time, that liquidity pool is going to rebalance. And even if it doesn't rebalance, from a nominal perspective, the liquidity provider can take out exactly the same amount of money that they put in, which was sitting there without any risk of default, without any operational risks, without any market risks, and then go home with his money. So we can talk a little bit about liquidity pools where the assets actually diverge in price against each other, but I think that should give you at least an introductory picture of how the liquidity providers benefit.
You talked about security in these systems already, but I would to add some more information about the security in the Vow ecosystem or in the liquidity pools on it. So because all people nowadays are in fear to do something with their money, because no matter where they put it, it's in danger. They're gonna lose it maybe. So
Yeah.
so I want to secure people that, yeah, I was fascinated about the security in the system. Please talk about that. What,
Certainly. So we need to talk about fundamentals first, right? Um, all of the liquidity pools and the smart contracts underneath them and the blockchains underneath them, they rely on a single security model, which is called asymmetric encryption, or there's another word for it, public-private key encryption. So I'll give you a little primer on encryption. A long time ago, there was a Peruvian king who wanted to send a message to another king to make arrangements about something, right? And it was really important that the information be secret. So what they did was they took this sort of stick, and they wrote their characters on the stick. And then they took a rope and made a knot wherever the character was that they wanted, right? And they took a whole bunch of these ropes and they tied them around some guy's waist, and he ran through the country, fields to the other king, who then took the ropes around the guy's waist and then went about measuring with the stick and decoded the message, right? And that worked reasonably well because some guy running through the countryside with a bunch of ropes around him was not really suspicious. And if he got caught, no one could read it because they needed the sticks, which in cryptography is referred to as a key, right? They needed the key in order to decipher the message. You have this rope, it has a knot here, but what does it mean, right? Oh, you need to put it next to the key and figure out what the character is. So this worked reasonably well up until World War II. And there are some problems with that approach. One of the problems is that if one of the keys is compromised, you don't necessarily have a way of knowing that, right? And so if the key becomes compromised, you now have to create a new key, but then you have to transport the key in a safe way, and you have the same problem as sending the message. If the message can be intercepted, maybe the key can be intercepted too. So then there are a number of scenarios that can happen. For example, the key transmission could be intercepted, read, and allowed to go through. It could be intercepted, read, and modified, and then sent on. It could be simply stopped, right? So the transmission is intercepted, and the other person never receives the key, right? There's these various attack vectors on it. So I think sometime in the 60s, someone came up with a new idea. The idea was that rather than having both parties have the same key, they could each have a key that was unique to them. So now you don't need a copy of it. You just have your own key, and you just protect your own key, and it never has to travel anywhere and be compromised. And so what you do is, when I want to write you a message, you have a private key with which you're going to decrypt that message. And the way that I encrypt the message is by using your public key. So if the public key is ever compromised, well, it can't be, because it's public. Anyone can have it, right? Which is to say, anyone can write a message and encode it to you. No problem there, but no one can decode it except you, right? You're the only one that has. So there's a relationship between the private key and the public key that is unique. And that relationship is based on elliptical math. There's basically an ellipse out there, and you pick a point, and through some algorithm, you can pick another point. And essentially, it's very easy to go from one point to the other, but it's super, super difficult to go from the other point back to the one point, right? So to talk about the security of our transmissions of communication, right, of our transmissions of messages, means to say that you need to be able to break the encryption of a private key. Now, there was some study done maybe like probably 10 years ago, I can't remember now. And they basically calculated that if you took all of the computing power on the planet and you set it to work to break one private key, it would take roughly 4.5 billion years to break it, right? That's about the lifetime of the planet. So in other words, is it possible to break the security that we're using underneath of the liquidity pools? Yes, it is. But by the time that we manage to break one key, well, who knows? The planet will probably not be around, right? Now, we could have incredible increases in computing power, right? Like people talk about optical computers and they talk about quantum computers. And yes, you could probably shorten that amount of work or the length of time it takes to break a single key from 4.5 billion years to, let's say, 2 billion, or let's say 1 billion. Forget it. Let's say 100,000 years, right? It's still not usable. And guess what? Even if the computing power became so great that we could actually break it in a reasonable time, like 6 months or 2 days, right? All that would happen is we just make the key bigger, and then you re-increase the length of time required to break it. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is the technology behind Bitcoin, and therefore behind Vow, is the most secure mechanism that we've ever invented. It not only is it secure from a theoretical perspective, but we actually have we have sort of computational proof of what it takes to break the encryption. And if you cannot break the encryption, then you cannot seize your funds, basically, right? Now, there's other vectors of attack. You can be careless with the private keys, right? And who holds the private keys? And that's like I can have discussions about that, but from the perspective of the safety of the funds, that's the basis of it.
Is there still a danger of loss in the Vow ecosystem if somebody brings the money in?
Yes, there is a danger of loss. So once you've secured the lowermost layer, which is the layer of message transmission, right? Now we know that's very secure. Now there's other things that happen. For example, a liquidity pool is basically a smart contract. And a smart contract is a piece of code that gets deployed by an account on the blockchain. So you basically create a private key, and you use that private key to deploy your piece of code to the network, which really means that you have control over that smart contract. And therefore, you could potentially steal the funds, right? Because you can operate that smart contract. So now we need to understand a little bit about smart contracts. A contract provides a series of mechanisms known as methods. It provides a finite number of methods and a specific number of methods with specific functionality. It's also a thing that gets peer reviewed. In other words, when you publish it, you actually show the source code to anyone who wants to look at it so that they can make sure that there are no backdoors, right? So that even if you have the private keys to deploy the smart contract, you cannot take the funds unless there is a method in the smart contract that allows you, as the owner of the smart contract, to take the funds. The liquidity pools that we're currently using are on Uniswap, and those are very well peer reviewed. There are no backdoors. They have very limited functionality, so they do exactly what they're expected to do and no more. And so from the perspective of, let's say, Vow as the deployer of the smart contracts, if they should even deploy, right? Which they're not, because in fact, it's Uniswap. But they're created under the account, right, of Vow. The deployer Vow does not have access to those funds. simply because there isn't a method inside of the smart contract with which it could have the priority to move things about, right? It can't just arbitrarily decide, oh, those funds, I'm just going to run off with them. Those smart contracts have been not only audited, many times, but also they've been battle tested, right? Because the other potential risk here is that even though the smart contract was peer reviewed and there are no back doors visible and no way to take advantage of it, it is always possible that the guys who coded it made a mistake. There's some special scenario where if you feed it this kind of value, it blows up, and in blowing up, it gives access to the hacker to go do like elevated permissions or things like that, right? So I'll give you a simple example. Let's say that you want to take a price of something, and you want to calculate the ratio of it against some other price, right? So let's say that a method accepts both of these numbers. Please divide this by that. So what happens is that a hacker could say, well, let's divide 1 by 0. And at that point, the smart contract tries to make the division, but it gets infinity because 1 divided by 0 is infinity. And it says, okay, I don't know how to do infinity. I don't have a register that is large enough to represent that number. And so it blows up. It throws what is known in code parlance an exception, right? And in the process of issuing that exception, it is sometimes possible for the hacker to elevate privilege, right, to gain access to stuff. So it's possible that the code could have one of these vulnerabilities, right? But it's been used by, I don't know, millions of people for probably hundreds of millions of transactions. And believe me, anytime that there's a whole bunch of money in one place, it calls hackers, right? It's called a honeypot. If there's a bunch of money sitting somewhere, someone is going to try to hack it. So that means that if in all this time Uniswap has not been hacked, it's probably pretty difficult to do so, right? It probably may not even be possible. So is there risk to the liquidity provider? Yes. We can never say that there's zero risk. But again, the risks are so small that when you compare them with the risk of investing your money into some corporate bond, or investing your money into even a country, or worse, investing your money in some project that looks scammy to begin with and was completely scammy, the risk is reasonably zero.
Could anything happen with the blockchain, Ethereum blockchain, or just with the internet? That
Absolutely. So let's just talk about. Let's say that you have the perfect smart contract, right? No vulnerabilities ever found, but the underlying engine could have bugs, right? They're constantly changing. They're upgrading and fixing stuff and enhancing stuff. And every time that you change the code, you could introduce vulnerabilities. Now that is a separate issue, and in fact, there is precedent for that. In the very beginning, when Ethereum started, and people could start writing smart contracts, they got really excited and they created this thing called the DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. And in fact, I was one of the investors in the DAO. I was so excited about the DAO. I loved the concept, etc. I put money into it. And then something happened. There was a bug in the code. And I don't honestly remember now if it was Ethereum code or if it was application code, but there was a point at which someone could do something that created a recursive behavior and basically wiped out the accounts, right? It was possible to use the method that sends money to call itself so that it sent basically everything out. And they stole a really large amount of money from the DAO. That was actually what caused the Ethereum fork. There were people who said, well, it was a bug and all the investors shouldn't be defrauded of this money by some hacker. So what we'll do is we'll roll back the clock. We'll just roll back the transactions to that point before the theft, and we'll patch it, and then we'll move on. And then there were people who said, no, we should never roll back the thing because it's supposed to be immutable. And if we roll it back, then we've proven that it isn't immutable, and now we can't trust it, right? And so that was called Ethereum Classic. So these kinds of things can happen at the sub application level, right? But obviously, the bigger the system, the more people, the more hacking attempts, and the better the testing and the sandbox environments that they create, where they do very, very thorough testing, because everybody understands if you let a vulnerability through, it will be found, it will be exploited, people will be hurt, and that will hurt the ecosystem. So they're really super careful about it.